Hey guys, welcome back to another Car Make Revive video. This is episode 2 where we're going to be doing the rear end assembly of the drift cart. Let's get snapping.
Yeah, get some.
Get all of it.
All of it.
This part.
Excellent. This bit.
恐怖は敵であり、味方でもある。
We're ready to assemble the rear axle at the moment. So what we're going to need is rear axle, stainless steel disc, 3 M6 by 40mm long socket head bolts, and 3 M6 nylock nuts. Let's fit these to the axle. Okay, we've placed the bolts through the disc, through the sprocket. We now want to fit the M6 nylock nuts.
Also guys, while Brett's doing that, these discs, they do get laser cut, so the edges can actually be quite sharp. So what we do is wrap a little bit of tape around them, so when you're getting in there and assembling it, no cuts, no grazes.
Don't get sliced open.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Don't hurt yourself, do that. And then just
mushy mushy.
Something like that. And then feel free to do a bit of teamwork.
Excellent. Now we need to tighten up those 3 bolts. Now completed the rear axle assembly, we want to place this axle assembly into the frame. Before we do that, we need to be careful to place the chain over the axle, since when the axle is placed into the frame, we won't be able to fit the chain on afterwards. So, chain over, take the axle. Now, the long side of the axle is going to be on the right-hand side of the cart, and the short side is going to be on the left-hand side, or pointing towards me. The next thing that we're going to need to fit onto our completed axle assembly is these 2 flange mount bearings. They'll be the last 2 bearings that are left in your kit. We're going to place them on either side of the axle right now. Like such. That can sit in the frame. While that's there, we're going to get the nuts, bolts, washers ready to fit the brake caliper mount and to bolt these bearings in place. In order to assemble or mount the bearings to the frame and our brake caliper bracket to the frame, this is what we're going to need. We need the twin caliper brake mount that is included in the kit. We're going to need 2 M10 by 25mm long hex-headed bolts, 2 M10 nylock nuts, and 2 10mm ID washers. And then for the other side, 2 M10 by 60mm long hex-headed bolts, 1 M10 by 50mm long hex-headed bolt, 3 M10 coupler or joiner nuts, 3 M10 nylock nuts, and 3 10mm ID washers. This will hold the bearings and the brake caliper mount in place. Let's fit them.
This next part is quite tedious, so you might want to take a step back, take a deep breath, and just take your time putting it together because it is a little bit tricky.
The first thing we're going to do is place the 2 M10 by 25mm long hex head bolts through this side of the bearing and through the frame. Now we're going to use the middle lot of holes, so there's 7 holes up the frame, so we are going to go to that middle hole. I've placed the two M10 by 25mm bolts through the bearing and through the middle holes in the frame. I'm now lightly going to put the two M10 washers or 10mm ID washers and the two M10 nylock nuts on from the back, just lightly. Beautiful. We're ready to assemble this left-hand side of the axle. This side of the axle gets pretty complicated. It's important that you guys take your time and at any point refer back to this video, refer to the close-up photos that we're going to show you later. What we're probably going to do after we finish assembling this side of the axle is we will remove the axle just to give a better close-up view of exactly how this assembly is going to look and how you guys need to make yours look. So, first thing I'm going to need is the two M10 by 60mm long hex-headed bolts. I'm going to place them through the bearing and through the frame from this side, again using that middle hole or that hole halfway up. So I've placed the two 10mm bolts partially through. I now want to grab my two M10 joiner nuts or coupler nuts, and I'm going to wind them on and wind the bolts through those coupler nuts. So I've wound my two M10 by 60mm bolts through the bearings, through the frame, and through my two M10 coupler nuts. Again, if I look at this completed assembly, I'm making sure that I've got my chain in place and that my disc is taped up so that we can't cut ourselves. We now want to fit our brake caliper bracket, our M10 by 50mm long hex-headed bolt, and our last coupler nut. So Matthew's holding the brake caliper bracket in the right orientation that it needs to be mounted. We can hook it around the axle, sit it over our two existing M10 by 60mm long bolts. Then we can feed our 50mm long M10 bolt through the frame, through our coupler nut, and through the bottom hole in this twin brake caliper bracket mount. As fiddly as it sounds, let's get it done. The next thing that we want to fit, or the last thing that we want to fit in order to button up this side of the axle, is the three 10mm ID flat washers and the three M10 nylock nuts that are going to retain that brake caliper bracket mount in place.
Also, while Brett's putting that together, all of the nuts and all of the assembly here that we've put together, he's just leaving it loose. He's just doing it all finger tight. You don't want everything tightened up as you go because you'll find it'll fight itself before you get to the end. You tighten everything up at the end once everything's in its happy place, ready to go.
We now have both our flange mounted bearings bolted in place, our brake caliper bracket, our chain is on our axle, otherwise we're not going to be able to fit it later on. We're going to tighten these up. Once this is all tightened up, just for your sake, we're going to remove the axle just to give you a better view of what that brake caliper mount and assembly with the bearing looks like, just so you guys at home can get this absolutely spot on. Now I want to tighten up the M10 by 60mm long bolt to the M10 coupler nut, making sure that it's really tight.
Click.
That's one. Go through, we're going to tighten up the second M10 by 60mm long bolt to the next coupler nut. Again, just making sure that it's nice and tight. I'm now going to tighten the bottom M10 by 50mm long bolt to the coupler nut. This is the one that passes through the frame and holds the bottom of the twin brake caliper mount. So all three bolts on this side are tightened through the frame and to the coupler or joiner nuts. I'm now going to tighten the three M10 nylock nuts up against the brake caliper mount. We've tightened all our bolts through the frame and the bearings. We've placed our M10 coupler nuts on, tightened them to the bolts. We've then have our brake caliper bracket mounted, and we've tightened our three M10 nylock nuts tight up against that brake caliper mount. Again, it's important at this point, take your time, be careful. When you tighten this up, get it as tight as possible.
All right, Brett's just going to remove the axle to give you guys a better view of how the brake caliper bracket actually sits.
Okay, for the sake of the people assembling this at home, we've removed the axle just to give an exceptionally clear view of what that brake caliper bracket and assembly should look like when it's all mounted, completed, bolted, everything's tightened up.
All right, now you guys have seen how the rear brake caliper bracket is mounted. I'm now going to give this back to Brett. He's then going to feed the axle back in, and we'll continue on with the rest of this build. Rightio, while Brett's just finishing that, you may notice that he's just using two spanners to assemble the rear end of it. If you guys want, you can use an impact gun, sockets, ratchet spanners. We're just doing this just so it's the most simplest and easiest way that you can put it together. If you don't have all the tools at home, this is all you need.
Because this is one of our BasicKart kits that we're now assembling, it comes with the hydraulic handbrake assembly only. We are going to fit this kit up now. In order to fit this kit, we're going to need two M8 by 16mm long bolts. Now in the kit we provide 4 bolts just in case later on you want to fit a foot brake hydraulics. The first thing we need to do is pull the tape off the disc that we place on there so we didn't cut ourselves in the first place.
It's very pleasing to watch.
So Matt is holding the hydraulics kit at the moment. The first thing we need to do is, in the brake caliper, there is a spacer that holds the two brake pads apart. We want to remove that spacer. Do it and throw it on the ground.
Kobe.
So we're going to drop our brake caliper down through the frame between the axle and this rear cross brace. Now going to put the caliper onto the disc, down nice and low. Once it's on, we can rotate it on the disc up and into place. So the hydraulic handbrake caliper kit will mount on the top 2 holes of the twin brake caliper bracket, and this hydraulic line will sit underneath this floor mount, just like that. Now that we have this sitting in place, I'm going to take my 2 M8 by 16 millimeter long socket head bolts and put them through the brake caliper bracket mount and into my top brake caliper.
This part that Brett's doing of putting the bolts in is actually a fair bit fiddly, so you'll need to play a little bit of Tetris with your hands in order to get them in the right place. Just take your time, it'll be right. Go team.
Go team.
Go team. You'll also find that Brett is using a long T-handle series Allen key with a ball end to put these 2 bolts in. Makes it way easier to put together, less fiddly.
Heaps easier.
Heaps easier. Get yourself a set.
Now that we've wound our 2 M8 socket head by 16 millimeter long bolts through our brake caliper mount and into our brake caliper, making sure they're tight and everything's aligned, one at a time we're going to back them out, Loctite them and screw them back in, nice and tight. Okay, it is really important with the brake calipers that the bolts that retain them are backed out and Loctited, as these were probably one of the first things that will vibrate loose if they're not Loctited. Okay, our hydraulic handbrake caliper is mounted or bolted to the brake caliper mount. Our axle is able to float left and right and is at the moment sitting in the center of the disc. On this kit, because it's our BasicKart kit, it won't have another caliper fitted, so we are going to nip up the grub screws on the bearings to stop the axle from floating left and right. It's worth taking 5 at this point and going through a quick basic checklist just to make sure that we're on point before we continue. So, we fitted the axle assembly with the chain on. We fitted both bearings, our brake caliper bracket. We made sure that all of our brake caliper bracket and bearings were tight. The next thing that we then fitted was the brake caliper to the brake bracket, making sure that we Loctited the 2 M8 bolts into the brake caliper. Once we did that, we tightened up the grub screws onto our axle. You may want to put some Loctite on those grub screws just to stop them from possibly vibrating out later on. If we're all good with that and it's all complete, we're ready to move on to mounting the hydraulic handbrake handle master cylinder, which can be seen just here. In order to mount that, we are going to need 2 M6 coach bolts or cup-headed bolts, 2 plain M8 nuts, and 2 M6 nylock nuts. Let's get to fitting this. The line should be already pre-run and rotated before you get the kit. It looks like it kind of wants to sit the wrong way, but we're going to wrap this around and tuck it up underneath this mount. We've spun the complete BasicKart kit around 180 degrees to give you a better view of how we fit the hydraulic handbrake master cylinder. It's going to originally be sitting something like this attached to its line. If we spin it down and around and then hold it up over the bracket, we're going to be mounting it something like that. Now, I'm going to lower this down so you can see better. There's two slots in the frame. One of those slots will be here, and the other slot will be just here. These are the two mounting holes for the hydraulic handbrake master cylinder bolts. I'm going to take my cup-headed or coach bolt, placing it through the slot in the frame. Now the slot in the frame is going to be a relatively tight fit on the bolt. Take my M8 plain nut and sit that over the top. So if I have a look, it's going to look something like this. Obviously our master cylinder is going to sit over those two bolts. Then we're going to place our two M6 nylock nuts in place. We've placed our master cylinder over our two M6 coach bolts or cup-headed bolts with our two M8 plain nuts as a spacer between the frame and the master cylinder. It's going to sit something like this. We're going to take our two M6 nylock nuts, tighten them on, just keeping them a little bit loose so that we could possibly adjust this master cylinder up or down. Just recapping, we've placed our two cup-headed or coach bolts through from the rear with our M8 plain nut as a spacer between the frame and the master cylinder, and our two M6 nylock nuts on from the front. We're now able to adjust the master cylinder up or down. We also need to be careful that the hydraulic line has been routed around the rear of this frame towards the brake caliper. It's now time to fit the hydraulic handle that Matthew has. In order to fit the hydraulic handle, we're going to need one M8 by 60 millimeter long socket head bolt, an 8 millimeter ID small OD washer, and a plain M8 nut. Obviously, all of this is included in both our kits. The first thing that we need to fit is the plain 8 millimeter socket head by 60 millimeter long bolt through the hydraulic handbrake handle. I'm then going to place on my 8 millimeter ID small OD washer. We're now able to take this assembly and wind it into the frame down here where the hydraulic handbrake pivot is. Hold that in. Once we've started the M8 by 60 millimeter long socket head bolt, I'm going to apply some lubricant to it, as this handle will obviously move backwards and forwards on that bolt. We've tightened up the hydraulic handbrake handle until it is slightly firm. At this point, I want to back off this bolt slightly so that the hydraulic handbrake handle moves slightly more freely. Just hold the top of the handle. Awesome. Lastly, the plain M8 nut that we have will be Loctited and placed on the back side of that M8 bolt as a lock nut, just so the bolt can't wind out as you're using the handbrake. To recap the mounting of the hydraulic handbrake handle, M8 by 60mm bolt through from this side with a small ID washer through the mount in the frame. We've placed the plain M8 nut on from this back side and we've Loctited it and used it as a locking nut. Should probably check at this point that the handle still moves nice and freely. Better than the one in my car.
Way better.
Awesome. We next want to attach our hydraulic handbrake to our master cylinder. In order to do that, we're going to need a 40mm long M8 dome-headed socket head bolt, an M8 nylock nut, and the piece of rubber hose that's supplied in the kit. First thing, M8 dome-headed bolt wound through the clevis in the end of the master cylinder, like such. We're then going to tighten up our M8 nylock nut on the back side of that socket-headed bolt. So we've tightened our M8 by 40mm long dome-headed cap screw through the clevis in the master cylinder, through the handbrake handle, and we've tightened our M8 nylock nut on from the rear. At this point, it's important to make sure that it sits nice and free and the handle moves easily. Now, obviously, what we said was included in the kit was this piece of small rubber hose. This is going to go over the exposed thread on the back of the M8 bolt and is going to sit up against the inside of the frame. We'll explain why this is the case shortly. We've mounted our hydraulic handbrake handle at the bottom. We've attached our hydraulic handbrake handle to our master cylinder. We now need to adjust it properly. If we were to look, there is a slight gap between the rubber that we've pressed over the bolt and the inside of the frame here. We need to adjust the push rod on the master cylinder so that the rubber tube over the bolt is tight or firmly against the inside of the frame. What this inevitably does is if the handle ever takes a hit in the wrong direction, it's going to stop the handle from pushing too far forward and damaging the master cylinder. So we have adjusted the push rod on the master cylinder so that our bolt that is attaching from the clevis to the handle and that rubber hose is up against the inside of the frame. We now want to lock off the nut that is on the master cylinder push rod. This one happens to be a 12mm. 12. Excellent. Ta-da! Works better than most people's hydros at home. The last thing we need to do is tighten the two nylock nuts that hold the master cylinder to the two coach bolts, holding that master cylinder to the frame. So I'm going to take my spanner, making sure that the master cylinder is nice and straight, and tighten those last two nuts. We've now tightened our master cylinder, or the two bolts attaching our master cylinder to the frame. Our bottom pivot is tight and Loctited, and our bolt through the clevis is tight, and our handbrake works mint. The last thing that we need to fit now that finishes our entire end is we can place our rear hubs on. We're going to grab the bits and pieces out and we'll show you what you need to do in order to fit the rear hubs. We're now going to assemble the rear hubs onto the axle, and in order to do that we need a few bits and pieces. So we have our 6mm by 6mm keyways. We have two of those. Two 10mm ID large OD thick gold washers. We have two M10 by 40mm long socket head bolts, and our assembled hubs. It's worth noting at this point, these 6mm by 6mm bits of key steel may need a bit of a clean up on some sandpaper, just because our 6mm keyway in the axle ends up a little tight just from the zinc plating process. It adds a little bit of extra thickness to it. So what I'm going to check even before we start is if one of those 6mm keyways fits in the 6mm keyway in the axle. Now it almost wants to fit. It may fit slightly better one way rather than the other, so it's worth checking it a couple of different ways. It's a little bit tight for my liking, so we're going to grab some sandpaper and give it a little bit of a linish or a clean down on some sandpaper in order to make it fit. We have some nice coarse sandpaper and our keyway. We're going to give this a bit of a clean up on the sandpaper and check it in the keyway on the axle to see if it fits. So we've sanded down our keyway slightly on both sides, pretty much just removing the zinc coating. We now want to try this in the keyway on the axle to make sure it fits. Like such. It's important that the keyway fits nice and easily. Don't take a hammer and bash it in there, otherwise you're going to create problems for yourself later on. Let's finish assembling the rest of this side, and then it'll be basically exactly the same on the other side. So, taking one of our hubs, we can slide it over, making sure that our pinch is loose and that our keyway is lined up with the keyway on the axle. We fitted that. Take our M10 by 40mm long socket head bolt and our 10mm ID washer and screw it in. We're going to lightly tighten up this bolt in the end of the axle. We're now going to tighten up the two pinch bolts nice and tight.
Fancy way of doing it.
Fancy. Now that our pinch bolts holding our hub onto our axle are nice and tight, we're going to remove this end retaining bolt in the axle, Loctite it with plenty of Loctite, and reinstall it. We've Loctited this end bolt, screwed it in. I'm just going to lightly nip it up. It's important not to tighten this too much, otherwise it's going to start closing up the rear of the frame. So Loctited the bolt and just nip it up. Done. Matthew's going to now repeat that process on the other side here. We'll get on to the next step. We've now installed all the rear end of our drift cart, axle, brake system, hydraulic handbrake, and fitted our hubs. Obviously, this is one of our BasicKart kits. We're now going to jump over to one of our ProKarts and have a look at the last thing that we need to install on it. because the ProKart actually comes with a hydraulic foot brake system as well. So we're going to jump onto that, install it, and show you it as well. We now have our ProKart in front of us. It comes with the additional foot brake, hydraulics, and caliper. We're going to get to fitting that now, get this kart spun around, and show you how it goes together.
Flame transition.
In order to fit our foot brake hydraulics kit to our ProKart, we're going to need to use the other two M8 by 16 millimeter long socket head bolts that are supplied in the kit. So I'm going to grab those two bolts. We're going to pass the caliper down between the engine mounting plate and the rear axle. Get them out to hold out the hydraulics. Being sure that the brake pads have enough separation to fit over the disc. Once I have the brake caliper sitting over the rear disc, we'll take those two M8 by 16 millimeter long socket head bolts and feed them through the brake caliper bracket and into the brake caliper. Again, just like when we mounted the caliper for the hydraulic handbrake, the first thing I want to do is wind the two bolts and nip them up loosely. Okay, much the same as when we installed the upper caliper or the handbrake caliper on the BasicKart kit. We nipped up the bolts, made sure the caliper was in the right location, and then one at a time we backed out the bolts, Loctited them, and put them back in. It's exactly the same with this bottom caliper. The caliper is sitting in the right place. I've done up my two M8 by 16 millimeter long bolts, making sure that everything is in the right spot and that the disc is centered. One at a time then, I'm going to back out those bolts, Loctite them, and put them back in. We have our foot brake hydraulics kit. We've mounted the brake caliper at the back. We're now ready to mount the master cylinder and reservoir at the front of the kart. In order to mount the master cylinder to the floor of the kart, we're going to require a couple of fasteners. So the first two that we're going to need are our M6 coach bolts by 30 millimeters long, two plain M8 nuts, and two M6 nylock nuts. We'll get the fasteners sitting through the floor in the right location and show you how it sits. I've placed my two M6 coach bolts or dome-headed bolts through the floor with my plain M8 nuts over the top. Our master cylinder will then sit over the top of these coach bolts, retained by our two M6 nylock nuts. It is worth noting at this point that the engine that we're fitting to this kart is obviously a manual engine. Therefore, the master cylinder or the foot brake setup on this kart will sit in the middle. If for some reason you were to fit a semi-auto engine to your ProKart frame, there is the allocation to run the master cylinder or the brake setup on the far left in this location. We've supplied the extra mounts in the floor. Let's take our master cylinder, sit it over the top of our fasteners. Take your two M6 nylock nuts, tightening these down from the top. I've now mounted the brake system master cylinder to the floor. I've tightened up my two M6 nylock nuts. Once the master cylinder has been mounted to the floor, the banjo bolt that holds this hydraulic line to the master cylinder can be moved. So if you're not happy with how this hydraulic line sits, take my 12mm spanner, loosen the banjo bolt in the end of the master cylinder slightly, and you can manipulate how this line sits. We've found that if it's pushed all the way to the left-hand side or towards you guys, then tighten it up, this clears when the engine is fitted. Later on, when we mount the engine into the frame, both these hydraulic lines for the handbrake system and the foot brake system will be zip tied back out of the way to keep them nice and neat. The last thing that we're going to need to mount is the brake master cylinder reservoir or remote reservoir. In order to mount this to the tab down here, we're going to need one M6 by 18mm long socket head and an M6 nylock nut. So this tab on the reservoir will sit on the back of this bracket, and the bolt's going to come through from the front. Now that we've mounted our master cylinder to the floor and we've mounted our remote reservoir to the bracket with our M6 bolt, that completes the brake setup on our ProKart here. We've just fitted our master cylinder for the foot brake hydraulics as well as the reservoir. All of our brake system for our ProKart and our BasicKart that we did before are all complete.
Also guys, remember to like, subscribe, hit that little bell notification, and stay tuned to our next video where we dive headfirst into the motor options for your drift kart.
Engines!
See you soon.
See you soon. Pew, pew, pew. Go to the axle so it's sitting roughly in place. You good?
What do you mean it doesn't fit?
It doesn't fit. And don't go through the hole! Everybody's seen Loctite before? I really want to be sponsored by Loctite.
Yeah, you keep saying.
Well, come at me, Loctite.
Yeah, well.
Let's lock it in. The last thing I suppose I need to do is mount this reservoir. Hit that bell, ring my bell, ring my bell.
Is that a song or did you just make that up?
No, it is a song.
It is a song.
It's like old. I'm old. Somebody old, yes. Dead probably. Oh damn, I'm sweating. And cut.
恐怖は敵であり味方でもある